So for this next section, we're going to be looking at a slightly different question. We started out with the question of who is likely to have a gift in their estate plans. Okay, this is a question about people who are alive now and what their current estate plans look like. This third question is different. Who is likely to make a charitable estate gift to charity at the end of life? Okay, now this is important because these documents that are done at different points during life, they're not necessarily the documents that are actually going to control anything. It's only the final will or trust document that actually controls the assets. And so if we're interested just in who wants to plan, then this first question is more important. But if we're interested in actually getting dollars to charity at the end of life, actually getting dollars to charity from estate gifts, then we've got to care about this third question, because this is when the dollars are actually transferred. Okay, this is planning, but only one of these plans, the last one, actually transfers dollars. So that's why we're interested in this third question. So let's address that. We're going to look at predicting who actually leaves a charitable estate gift at death. Now, how can we do this? Well, the reason we can do this is not only does the Health and Retirement Study track people year after year after year and track the changes in their estate plans and whether there are changes in the charitable component of their estate plans, but it also tracks what actually happened to the estate of people who have been in the study who have died. At this point, we've had over 12,000 people in the study who have died, and so we have a pretty good idea of some of the things that are taking place in terms of where the money is actually going. So let's look at predicting who actually transfers dollars to charity at death. And once again, we're going to jump into a academic journal article. Now, this article, you may notice, was published a little while ago. And so because it was published a little while ago, it's using earlier data from the Health and Retirement Study. That was back when we had about 6,000 deceased panel members. We've now got more than double that. But the results that you're going to see here, not only are they published, but they follow generally what we're continuing to see, even as this data set has grown more than doubled over the years. So let's look at some of these results. Again, what's different with this table compared to what we were looking at before is that here we're looking at people who have died. So these are people who were in the Health and Retirement Study or a predecessor study, and then at some point along the way, they died. Okay, and so that's what's different compared to the previous study. And we only have two different categories of people here. People who actually transferred dollars to charity at death, that is the estate donors, and those that did not transfer dollars to charity at death. About 5.3% of the population estimated actually transfers dollars to charity at death. What are some differences on this estate donor versus non-estate donor? Oddly, in this particular sample, there wasn't a difference in estate size. There's a bit of a difference here. Now, again, this is a pretty small sample. We've only got 302 people that were decedents who actually left estate gifts. And so that's part of what's happening here. No surprise here, estate donors gave more during life. So this was their annual giving averaged over their previous reports. This was their volunteering on average during the year immediately prior to their death. It's a bit higher, but since this is such a small sample, not statistically significant. The average estate gift was $161,774. Pretty large, considering the average estate size was only $615,000. That's a pretty big gift. The estate donors are a bit older than decedents who are non-estate donors. They are less likely to have been married at death, then more likely to be non-Hispanic white, less likely to have been male in this group, and they had on average fewer children and a bit fewer grandchildren, but it doesn't rise to statistical significance. Other differences, less likely to have not graduated from high school, much more likely to have had a graduate education, and in general, more likely to have had education. So for the most part, this is fitting what we have seen when we look at people who are alive and the characteristics between those who include a charitable component in their estate plan and those who don't. But now we're looking at people who have actually deceased. Some other differences in the characteristics. Here what we're looking at is a bit more of a focus on what they were doing during life. Okay, so this is looking at, again, the estate giving for deceased panel members, and at this point we had about 6,000 deceased panel members when this study was done. And here's where we see this huge impact of childlessness. Okay, so look at this group that has no children, and you look at their average annual giving during life. These are all people who have deceased. And how does that compare to the group of decedents as a whole? Well, this is actually quite a bit larger. Then when we look at the estate gift size, the estate gift size is much larger here on average for those who have no children. Now, you may notice that this number, 44,849, although it is larger, it is much smaller than what we saw earlier with this number. Say, well, wait, what's the difference here? Well, the difference is this is among only those who are leaving gifts. The average gift size is $161,000, but notice that 95% of folks left $0, right? So the average estate gift among everybody, estate donors and non-estate donors, is going to be much, much less than this number because 95% of folks aren't giving anything, and you'd have to average those two together. So just to avoid any confusion there, that's why we're looking at much smaller numbers here because we're including everybody, not just those who made estate gifts, but the vast majority of people who made no charitable estate gifts. So again, looking here, those who are childless, they gave more during life. This is their average donations while they were in the survey, and they gave dramatically more in estate gifts. And so if we look overall at the group as a whole, childless individuals, they give 12 and a half times their annual donation average at death. We compare that to, for example, people with grandchildren who give less, and they actually leave, on average, estate gifts much, much less. And so this is, they're giving less than 3 times their annual giving. Now, a couple of things, again, we're using this to project to a national population. That's why we've got these numbers in parentheses, just indicating how confident we are in this particular number. Notice this is a really wide range here because, look, estate gifts in general are really skewed. because there's always going to be a handful of multimillionaire billionaires that make really large gifts, and so that makes these numbers really bouncy. And especially if we're looking at a relatively small category like childless individuals, we get an even bouncier number. But what this is telling us is how we can actually rank the importance of this factor as compared to annual giving. So if you know the childlessness status of somebody and you're working for a charity and you know their annual giving, you can actually use those two factors to project on average within the group how much are you expecting from estate gifts. So who do you want to talk to first? Well, you look at their annual giving. If they have grandchildren, you can multiply that by 2.89. That's going to tell you what you can expect from the group as a whole to receive in estate gifts. Maybe not to your organization, but to some organizations. Whereas if they are childless, you instead take their annual giving and you multiply it by 12.54, and that will give you the projected estate gift. So it actually gives you kind of a handy way to translate their annual giving into the estate giving. So let's now look at, and this is using actually the more recent data with over 12,000 people in it. Let's now look at the top 10 lifetime predictors of a post-mortem bequest gift. So in other words, what are the characteristics of people that we can see while they're alive that are the most important predictors of a post-mortem bequest gift? And we'll get into the details of what this means. But let me just give you descriptively that top 10 list. The number one most important factor by this particular methodology was the consistency in giving. So what this is, and actually let me just go ahead and jump into the technical results here, which is this table. So what this is this is showing of all of the years that the person was in the survey, what percentage of those years did they indicate that they gave $500 or more to charity? Okay? So if they did that every year, then this would be a 1. If they did that none of the years, then this would be a 0, right? If they did it half the years, this would be 0.5. All right. Now, let me talk about the technicalities of this top 10 list and where it comes from. The technicalities. First, how do we get this? And second, why is childlessness number 2? Right? I've spent all of this time talking about how important childlessness is, and yet it shows up as number 2 on our top 10 list. Well, that has to do with the statistical methodology that's being used to do this prediction. The way this methodology works is, and it's called Stepwise Regression. What it is we put every possible variable into the model. And for this particular test, we put about 60 different variables in. And we just said, okay, computer, if you only can use one of these variables to predict who's actually going to transfer anything to charity at death, what is the one variable that is going to explain the greatest amount of technically what's called variance, all right? And the greatest amount of variation between who actually leaves gifts at death and who doesn't, okay? Now, the reason that consistency in giving shows up as the number one most important factor, in other words, if you could only pick one thing, what are you going to pick? Is that the lack of offspring doesn't explain as much of the results, because it applies to a relatively small percentage of the population. This lack of offspring doesn't give us any information among those who actually have children or children and grandchildren, which is by far the great majority of everybody in this over 50 population. And so because it doesn't give us any information about those people, it's not the best predictor to explain the most variation in our outcome, which is whether or not they left a gift to charity at death. So that's why consistency in giving is number one. So if we only had one variable that we got to pick, the best variable to pick to predict who is going to leave a gift at death is their consistency in making charitable gifts during life. So what's the power of that? Well, the power of that is this. This is how this works. If we had someone who never donated, okay, during the time that they were in the study, or at least didn't donate at least $500 or more to charity, then we would expect that on average, that group of people that never donated would have about a 2.36% chance of actually transferring dollars to charity at death. Okay? Now, if we had somebody who every single year they were in this survey, they reported giving at least $500 to charities in the previous calendar year, that person would have a combined rate of 11.04%. So we're adding this base rate to their 100% of all years. So this is a 1 times 8.69 to this in their giving, and we would say that person would have about 11% chance that they're actually going to transfer dollars to charity at death. Again, if they gave half the years, then you would cut this number in half and you would add it to the base rate. That's how this model works in its prediction. Now, that's what you would use if you could only use one variable. If you could use two variables, the second variable you're going to pull in is you're going to pull in childlessness. So how does that work? Well, again, let's say you've got somebody who gave every single year and they were childless. We would actually add all of these together. So that person's propensity would be about 19%, because if we added all these things together, we would that comes up to be about 19%. So for that person, we would predict a 19% probability that they're actually going to transfer dollars to charity at death. So this allows us to compare what's the difference between somebody, in this case, somebody who is not a donor, so this would be a 0 in here, but they are childless, or somebody who is a donor, but they have children. And you can see that in this particular model, before we control for anything else, these seem to be pretty close. Once we start controlling for other things, we'll see actually that the lack of offspring is a more powerful predictor than consistency in charitable giving. So then let's look at the next model. If we want our best 3-variable model, what's going to best explain the variation in our outcome, that is the best predictors of who is going to actually leave a gift to charity at death. We now want to know what was the largest gift they ever reported making. Specifically, not the largest single gift, but what was their largest giving year. Right? So of all of the years that they reported, how much they were giving, what was the largest combined amount for any calendar year that they gave to charity. And so the idea here is we not only want them to be consistent in their giving, but we would like for them to have made a large gift at some point. Now, the way that this is modeled is that we're looking at this in thousands of dollars. So, for example, if their largest gift was $1,000, then we would add on 0.12% likelihood increase that they would leave a gift to charity. If their largest gift was $10,000, then we would add on a 1.2% likelihood increase that they're going to leave a gift to charity. Now, when you measure a dollar variable, you've got some choices, and the choices basically are you can do it this way, which makes it easier to interpret, right? I can see if a person left a $10,000 gift, that's 1.2 percentage point. If they left $100,000, if they made a $100,000 gift to charity during some year, that's going to be about a 12% increase in their likelihood of leaving something to charity at death. And so that's really easy to interpret. The problem is that the interpretation gets stupid at a certain point, because you can actually have this number be so high that this number gets to be over 100%, which doesn't make any sense. So the challenge is that it's easier to interpret, but it gets crazy at the high end. So the way we normally do this in the more formal papers is that we would use the log, the natural log of this number, and it would show the impact of doubling giving. And so what would be the percentage impact each time we doubled that giving? And so that prevents the numbers from getting too crazy, but it's much more challenging to describe that descriptively. So that's why this is just reported in thousands of dollars. It works fine when we're talking about the normal donation level. Obviously, it's not going to work fine if you try to estimate it for somebody whose largest gift was $10 million, right? That's not the right form statistically to use for that kind of person. But this gives you a sense of that this is important. Not just their consistency in giving, but also what was their largest gift. And then we have this one. Might be a little bit surprising to you, but we'll actually discover why this is so important. This was their consistency in reporting that they had a funded trust. So not a will, not just a will document by itself, but they also had a funded trust, typically a living trust or inter vivos trust. Notice the massive impact from somebody who always reported while they were in the study that they had a funded trust during life. Just that factor alone increases the propensity to actually transfer dollars to charity at death by 10 percentage points, more than 10 percentage points. That factor alone actually more powerful than childlessness. So kind of a surprise just how powerful that factor is, and we're going to talk about why that is such a powerful factor. So some other factors, if we start looking at now, we add in the best 5 variable model. Our 5th variable is going to be gender of the decedent. Women when we're controlling for these other things, women were about 2.5 percentage points more likely to transfer dollars to charity at death. This now adds in for a 6th variable model is wealth. Now, I will say that here I did log this number because otherwise it just doesn't make sense. And so this is actually the log of wealth. And so this is showing as each time wealth doubles, if you're comparing two different people, if one has 2 times or 4 times or 8 times the wealth of the other, this shows the propensity increase in the tendency to include a charitable gift, an actual charitable transfer at death. Now, another thing I want to mention to you here is notice once we start controlling for things like the amount of donations, their consistency in reporting to trust, their wealth, female status. Notice what happens here. Notice how once we're controlling for all of these other things, consistency in giving becomes less important, relatively speaking, than childlessness. because we're beginning to control for the size of giving, for example, and some of these other factors. Let's continue on with our best 7 variable model. The 7th variable we're going to add in is whether they were married when they died. And if they were married when they died, then that counts for a drop of about 2 percentage points in the likelihood of leaving a gift. Then the next factor is how much were they giving in the last survey before they died. All right, so we're already measuring their largest giving year that they ever reported, and we're also measuring their consistency in giving. But even beyond those 2 factors, it's a very positive indicator if they continue to give a lot, not just at some point in their lives, but in particular right up to the point of death. The 9th most important factor here is wealth trend. Now notice we're already including the size of their wealth. This is the natural log of their wealth. We're already including the size of how much wealth they died with, but it turns out it's important not just how much wealth they died with, but whether that wealth, whether they died with that wealth where their wealth was going up before they died, right? Or if they got to that same wealth, but it was as they were going down. So it's not just a matter of how much wealth they died with, right? But did they come down to that wealth or did they come up to that wealth? Because when people's wealth increases, if they're on a good trajectory, they feel wealthier. And when people feel wealthier, they become more charitable. We see this in lots of experiments as we get into the psychology of charitable decision-making a bit later. We'll see that if you make somebody feel wealthy, they become more charitable. And if you make them feel like they're less wealthy, they become less charitable. So there is this subjective sense that it's not just a matter of how much they died with, but it's a matter of their trajectory. If they had a positive trajectory, the wealth trend, then their propensity to leave a gift goes up. If they have a negative wealth trend trajectory, and this, by the way, this wealth trend, this is just the straight linear trend during their life leading up to their death. What was their linear trend, straight line trend in what their wealth was doing? And so if that, as that trend's going up, their propensity to give goes up as well. The last item is consistency in volunteering. Obviously consistency in giving, that's the most important factor. In fact, if we only got one factor, that's the one we would use. But by the time we get to a 10 variable model, we're also going to include consistency in volunteering. So that's the technicality of how this model works, what the predictions are. And so if you wanted to predict somebody's propensity to actually transfer dollars to charity at death, you could add up all these numbers and it would give you a rough estimate prediction. Now, of course, there are things can get crazy, and so the model's not perfect. So if you get somebody who gave a massive amount, if they gave $10 million, this number is going to be over 100%. That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, if you got somebody who, let's say over here, if you're using a 6 variable model, if you got somebody who never donated, they had children. I already said they never donated. They never reported having a trust. They were male, and let's say they had relatively little wealth. You might actually end up with a negative prediction number, right? There's a negative 3% chance that they're going to leave money to charity at death. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. You can't have a negative probability of doing something. These kinds of models aren't perfect, but they give you a general predictive number depending upon how many of these pieces of evidence that you have that lets us know a little bit about what's happening. Now, Most of these we got a sense of from our previous descriptive results, but the one that should be standing out to you a bit now is this guy here. Consistency in reporting having a funded trust. Not only did it come up as in just a 4-variable model that we bring that in. We get beyond 3 variables. That's the next thing we want to bring in. But it is a massive, massive indicator. Look at how strong it is in predicting whether somebody actually transfers money to charity at death. We're looking at, over 10 percentage points here. Now, part of that is because these people are wealthier. People who have trusts are wealthier. But even when we control for wealth, which is what we do here, it's still a very, very strong indicator. And so even in these different models where we're controlling for wealth, we've still got this as a strong indicator. So we need to investigate this. What's going on? And fortunately, we do have the opportunity to investigate this. We have the opportunity to investigate this because we can compare people, decedents, based upon what they said in their most recent survey prior to death in terms of whether they had a will, whether they had a trust. So let's first look at wills. We're now going to look at this question of what happened to people who reported in their last survey before they died that they had a written and witnessed will document. Okay? So now we're going to look at, after those people died, what happened. And I think it's pretty interesting to see what happened. Now, what we're looking at here is among those people who said they had a written and a signed and witnessed written will document, and here we're looking at 7,150 decedents. This is from a total of about 12,000 decedents. And we're looking at what actually happened to those will documents. Now, for me, the interesting part is that in 38% of those cases, the will document actually controlled something. Let me repeat that. In 38% of the cases, that will document actually controlled something. So what's going on here? Well, let's take a look at this. In 17% of the cases, the heirs indicated that there was no will found. Okay? Maybe the testator intentionally destroyed the will document for the purpose of revocation. Maybe the heirs found it and they intentionally destroyed the document for the purpose of revocation. Not really sure what happened there. By the way, we can say that there actually wasn't a big difference between whether the person had reported a charitable component or not as to whether or not the will wasn't found. But that was only 17% of the cases. In a large share of the cases, everything here, these are all heirs who are saying, yeah, they had a will document, but no, we didn't use it. Now, for people who are not familiar with estate planning, that could seem like a bit of a shocking statement. What do you mean you didn't use the will document? The confusion is caused because of a lack of understanding of what a will document is. A will document is actually only a backup document. The will document is there only in case something does not have, for example, a transfer on death designation, or joint ownership with right of survivorship, or a beneficiary, such as life insurance, 401k, IRA account. So in the large number of cases, there was a will, and the will controlled nothing. Why does the will control nothing? The will controls nothing because there are no assets solely titled in the name of the decedent that had no joint ownership with right of survivorship, transfer on death designation, trust titling, any of those sorts of things. So this is why we get this large section that's taking place. So what's happening here? Well, in some cases, the heirs said there wasn't much of value. What does that mean? That means that we didn't probate it because there was nothing titled. There were no titles that we needed to change. You know, the stuff around the house or the money under the mattress, you don't have to go through court to retitle that. It doesn't have a title on it. So that was nothing much of value. The most common reason was to say the estate was otherwise distributed. What's that mean? Well, that's all these non-probate transfers that we talked about before. The TOD designations, POD designations, beneficiary designations, all of that. Those control. The will doesn't control any of those sorts of things. In some cases, the will didn't control anything because everything had been retitled in the name of a trust. This is actually the trust, and then this is this was nothing much of value, and this is unprobated will other. It goes in clockwise fashion. Sorry about that. Notice there. But the bottom line is, as the headline says here, reported wills are often unused. People are saying, yeah, I had a will. And in 38% of the cases, that will controls nothing. Now, how does that connect with wills and trusts and actually making charitable transfers? Well, let's take a look here. We had over 1,100 folks who, in their last survey prior to death, indicated that they had a funded trust. 76% of those cases, the heirs are saying, yeah, that funded trust exists and it is functioning. Okay, so this is a pretty big difference between the 38% of wills that controlled something and the 76% of trust that controlled something. Now, I got to tell you that this difference is actually larger than what you see here. Why? Or it could be larger. Why do I say that? Because this 38%, this is a maximum, okay? Because the heirs have to be notified of the probating of a will by law, okay? This here, the heirs might have been over here saying, oh, no, there's no funded trust, when in fact there was a funded trust. They just weren't a beneficiary of it, so they didn't know it existed, right? So in fact, this number is likely in reality larger than this 76%, which means this gap is probably even larger. So do you see how this would affect people who are actually transferring dollars to charity at death? Because here, if I got a will document and that will document names a charity, 38% of the cases, that will document doesn't control anything, right? Whereas the trust document is actually controlling something. Now, this is a big deal because, look, there was a time in history when estate planning happened at one point in time, and that was in the lawyer's office. It happened with one document, that was the will document, and that will document controlled everything. That was a point in time in history when we did not have transfer on death designations, much less transfer on death designations on real estate, of all things, right? We didn't have all these TODs and PODs. We had not gone through the non-probate transfers revolution. So what we may actually be seeing here is the reality that people think they have a charitable component in their estate plan because they have charity in their will document that controls nothing. What happens is you'll have people who have a charitable component in their will document, and then they go to open a new IRA. And the question is, do you want to have beneficiary designation on the IRA? Oh yeah, I'll put the kids on there, right? Or they open a new bank account. Oh, do you want to put a TOD on there? Oh yeah, let's put the kids as TOD on there to avoid probate. And they may not be at that time realizing that every time they do that with an account, they are disinheriting the charity. And in fact, rather than that being a rare circumstance, we see that it's the typical circumstance that ultimately those will documents control nothing. And that is why these funded trusts are so important in predicting who's actually going to transfer dollars to charity at death, even when we are controlling for the wealth of people. All right, so now let's dive into a little bit more. Once again, yet another academic journal article. In this one, we're using Health and Retirement Study. Now, this is a published article, so this is a little bit older Health and Retirement Study. So we didn't have quite as many decedents as we did in the results that you just saw. In this article from the Journal of Financial Counseling and Planning, we are looking at the effectiveness of wills, trusts, and their effectiveness in actually transferring dollars to charity. So the question here was whether or not it was actually the trust that was driving the charitable result, or was it actually instead just the characteristics of the people who happen to have trusts? Is it actually the document difference that's driving this result, or is it the difference in the kinds of people who happen to have these documents? So I'm pulling from Table 3 of this journal article, and this is predicting who actually transferred money to charity. And again, this is among those who said in their final survey before they died, I have a charitable component in my will or trust. Okay, so these are people who, right before they died, they said, yeah, I've got a charitable component in my will or trust. I'm expecting to transfer dollars to charity at death. And we want to see, did the document make a difference as to whether or not they actually transferred dollars to charity at death? Okay. So this is a regression. Now, we're not going to get into what these numbers mean other than whether they're positive or negative and whether they're bigger or larger, and in particular, if they're statistically significant. So we start out with the simplest regression model, and what this tells us is that if we're just including this variable, did they have a trust? This is statistically significant predictor, and it's positive. It's a positive statistically significant predictor of whether they are actually going to transfer dollars to charity at death. Oh, and I just realized this is actually a linear probability model, so we can roughly interpret these as percentage points. So we could say ballpark among those who reported in their final pre-death survey that they had a charitable component in their will or trust, the likelihood that at death they're actually going to transfer dollars to charity goes up by about 21 percentage points if they have a trust. Okay, so if they reported that and they didn't have a trust, which means they had a will, because in order to report you have a charitable component in your will or trust, you have to have a will or trust, right? So if they didn't have a trust, the likelihood that among those who reported having a charitable component, the likelihood in their final pre-death survey, the likelihood that they actually transferred money to charity in their estate is about 35%. But if they had a trust, if they reported a trust in their final pre-death survey, that likelihood goes from 35% to about 56%. Okay, massive, massive difference. Now, question is, maybe that's just a difference of the different characteristics of the people who have these kinds of documents. So in this next analysis, we'll control for how wealthy they are. Wealthier people are more likely to have trusts. We saw that in the earlier descriptive statistics. And also include a control for their self-reported health status in the last survey prior to death. Sort of how surprising was it that something happened. And what we see here is that we still have a significant difference here. This was not simply a difference in that people who have trusts are wealthier, even though they are. That's not what was driving this outcome. It was in fact having the trust document. Then in this last analysis, we go ahead and say, let's also control not only for wealth, but for income. Let's control for whether they are married or not. Let's control for whether they had children and grandchildren, or controlling for whether they had children alone. Let's control for some racial characteristics, and again, the comparison here would be with other racial characteristics. Control for their age at death and gender. And even when we control for all of these things, it turns out that the presence of a trust document is still significant in predicting whether or not folks who thought they were going to transfer dollars to charity actually do transfer dollars to charity. And as far as the other factors that we see that connect those who thought they were going to transfer dollars to charity, who actually transfer dollars to charity, no big surprises here. Higher income is better. Not being married. This is a big factor. Because consider, this is a big factor because you might have somebody who says, yes, I have a charitable component, but it doesn't get into whether that charitable component takes effect at the death of the first spouse or the death of the surviving spouse. So this was a big factor here as to whether they actually transferred dollars to charity. No surprise here. This is... both of these were negative as compared to childlessness. This means that this is statistically significant, but only at a relatively small, a relatively high level of significance. Now, we only had a few folks that actually transferred dollars to charity here, so it's okay that we're bumping this up to perhaps that level. Older adults more likely to actually transfer. So bottom line, what does that mean? It means the document does make a difference, okay? We can control for all the things we want to control, but if you've got somebody who says, yeah, I got a charitable component in there, if it's in a will, that is much, much less likely to actually generate dollars for the charity than if it's in a trust. And that's true even if we're looking at people with the same wealth, same income, same family characteristics, various other factors like this. So it is, in fact, the document itself that is important. So this means it is useful to understand the importance of documents. It is useful to understand that the kind of document matters. The will is only a backup document. That it is important, if we actually want to transfer dollars to charity at death, that we ask about titling and beneficiary designations. There are so many charities that will say, well, we are very careful in our documentation. We actually want a copy of the will. Well, actually, most wills are never used. So it's great that you have a copy of the will document and it names your organization in there, but most of those will documents are never used. 38% of will documents actually control something. This suggests that we need to broaden the conversation if we actually want to get dollars transferred to charity. We've got to ask about titling and beneficiary designations because these things control before the will ever gets involved. Now, the reason I say especially qualified plans is this. Very simple. As a financial planner, if you have somebody who wants to make an estate gift to charity, the very first thing we want to give to charity is the IRA or the 401k or some part of it, right? Why is that? Very simple answer. If the kids or other heirs get that money, they have to pay income taxes on it when they pull it out. Any of that money that goes to charity completely avoids income taxes. There's a lot of people that think, oh, well, our estate tax exemption levels are so high now, 11 million, 22 million, more than 22 million for a married couple. I don't have to worry about that. Yeah, you don't have to worry about estate taxes, but you do have to worry about income taxes. And when the kids or any other heirs that aren't charities inherit that 401k, IRA, anything other than like a Roth IRA that the taxes have already been paid on, when they pull that money out, they got to pay the taxes. So we want to give that money first to charity because charity doesn't have to pay taxes when they take that money out. So that can be a way to get into the conversation about titling, about beneficiary designations, and also a way to make sure that the donor's intentions of making a charitable estate gift are actually fulfilled. Next idea is it's very helpful to encourage trust planning. We see that it is actually the document that's making the difference. Because it is the document that is making the difference, we would be well suited. It would be a very appropriate strategy if we actually want to get dollars to charity at death to encourage trust planning, because that difference in documentation that made a big difference. And then finally, depending upon how aggressive you want to get, one strategy is to do this. Doesn't always help, but it could help. Is to consider alternate will language, such as I leave a dollar amount equal to, say, 10% of my adjusted federal gross estate for federal estate tax purposes. This adjusted federal gross estate is still defined in different parts of the tax code. And what does this mean? What it means is I am writing in my will document that I want to leave, let's say it's 10%, I want to leave 10% of everything that I own, not just 10% of whatever happens to be going through the will. Okay, so 10% of everything I own is what I want to leave to the charity. Now, this can allow a larger share to go to the charity if you've actually got something going through the will document. All right, if nothing's going through the will document, then this language isn't going to help you at all. It's just saying, oh, there's a larger bequest for the charity in that will document that controls no assets, right? That doesn't matter what's in the will document at that point. But if you have a will document that's controlling some of the estate, and you are saying, I don't want to leave 10% of just what goes through the will to my charity. I want to leave 10% of everything I own to the charity. It can allow for a larger gift coming to the charity. The other thing we're doing here is using the phrasing a dollar amount equal to. By using this formula, this calculation, this is a bit of an attempt to bump up the order in which this gift is paid. Specific pecuniary bequests are paid before percentage bequests, so this is a bit of an attempt to bump that up into a pecuniary bequest. The other thing this does, and perhaps the most important thing this does, is if in your language description that you are suggesting for your donors, it's often the case that organizations will say, here's our suggested language for bequest. If you have this as one of your suggested phrases, something that includes this phrase. So, for example, you might have a suggested phrase that this would be a suggested phrase for a simple will, as opposed to a suggested phrase for a comprehensive estate plan that might simply be X percent of my estate. Is that if you suggest this language and a donor brings that language into an estate planning lawyer and says, oh, here's the suggested language, it is likely to trigger the question. Wait a second. When you say you want to leave a 10% gift to this charity, do you mean 10% of your probate estate, meaning 10% of what goes through the will, or do you mean 10% of everything that you own? Do you mean you also want like 10% of your IRA that isn't going to go through the will, and 10% of your TODs that aren't going to go through the will, or 10% of your life insurance death beneficiary? Do you want 10% of that to go to the charity as well? And so that's a really important win if you have triggered that question. Because now, if a person desires, and most commonly I would suggest that when somebody says 10%, they mean, 10% of everything, right? But it triggers that question. It alerts the estate planner to this issue so that they will inquire specifically, does that charitable intent, when you say percentage, is it a percentage of what? What is it a percentage of? So it's great to trigger that conversation. All right. One last technical note. Again, we're asking the question: who is likely to make a charitable estate gift to charity at the end of life? One other technical note, and that is that wealth is a good predictor. Obviously, we already saw that when we looked at the predictors here. Our top 10 predictors, the wealth that a person died with, that came in as in our 6-variable model. That's when we added in wealth. It's an important predictor, and not only wealth but wealth trend came in our 9-variable model. But it also matters the kind of wealth that a person has. Okay, so this is from another academic journal article. And this one is looking at what kind of wealth actually is predictive, and it actually makes a really big difference. It turns out that wealth is a good predictor, but it's mostly what you might call financial wealth. It's mostly not housing wealth. There is a tendency for people not to leave housing wealth to a charity. More likely that people leave housing wealth to family members. And so it is the non-housing wealth, which is typically the financial wealth, that is actually the strong predictor of leaving a charitable estate gift. Okay, so what are we looking at here? This is where we are looking at, once again, regressions. These are what we might call linear probability model or OLS regressions. Because these are OLS regressions, we can fairly directly interpret the results that we've got here. And interestingly, we've got two different data sets here. We've got the HRS, and this was published a little bit ago. So we are looking at just one particular year of the HRS, and we're looking at Australian probate records. So this is actually people who transferred dollars to charity at death. This was a 5% sample of the national records in Australia, probate records for a particular year. And the reason we're using 2006 HRS is because of we're comparing that with the 2006 Australian probate records. And what this comparison shows us is net worth is a useful predictor. Being a homeowner is a useful predictor. Homeowners are more likely to have a charitable estate plan. Homeowners are more likely to actually have a charitable estate gift among decedents. But notice what we've got here. The share of net worth that is represented by the home, that's actually significant, and it's negative. That's true in the United States. That's true in the Australian data as well. So in the U.S. data, we can control for all these other factors. We did not control for those. We didn't have all that information from the probate records necessarily. But what this suggests is that as the share of wealth that is held in the home goes up, the propensity to have a charitable estate plan or to actually transfer dollars to charity at death, that propensity goes down. So just a little wonky side note there that wealth is a good predictor, but it's really non-housing wealth that counts. And the higher and higher proportion of wealth that is held in housing, the lower and lower probability that a person is going to engage in charitable estate planning or actually transfer dollars to charity at death. So that's a little bit about this question of who is likely to make a charitable estate gift to charity at the end of life. Next, we'll deal with the question of who is likely to make a large charitable estate gift at the end